My name is James Dolan, and visiting here from the west coast of the U.S. I'd like to thank my hosts for allowing me to be here, Dr. Nag in particular for inviting me, our superintendent for allowing me to visit. And it's my great pleasure to be here in India. This is my second time. There's a number of things that strike me about being in India. First is the hospitality, which is always, for us, coming from America sometimes, it's somewhat overwhelming. But nonetheless, it's always very, very welcomed. And the second thing is, it's very nice to be able to come to a conference and not have to wear a tie so I can present, which is the other characteristic I find when presenting sometimes in India as well. I'd like to talk today about a subject which is robotics. This is a subject that, as a robotic surgeon myself, I could probably take an entire seminar to talk about because of the complexities of the economics behind robotics, because of the applications of robotics, what type of surgery should be used for robotics, and even other things related to that as well, the safety of robotics. Remember, this is an instrument where the surgeon, surgical robotics at least, where the surgeon sits 20, 25 feet away from a patient, and if there's a complication, they're not immediately there to take care of it. So there are all these issues that go along with robotics in general. But instead of that, I wanted to take just a very brief overview of the basic surgical robotics itself. The past, the present, of the future is really what I wanted to talk about today. So, just a little bit about myself before we start. I'm here today with my wife, Marianne. This is Marianne's first visit to India, and she's enjoying herself thoroughly very well. But I wasn't born in America. I was actually born in a very small farm in rural Ireland, where I grew up and did my primary and secondary education, and then came to the United States after that to do both my college, my medical degree, my undergraduate surgery degree. I did a tumor immunology fellowship, and then I went north to Portland in Oregon, which is this little city on the west coast of the United States, and did a fellowship there in minimally invasive surgery back in 2000, when minimally invasive surgery was the new thing to do. And I was very fortunate to work with an individual by the name of John Hunter, who is one of the premier surgeons in the nation and the world at this time. And John taught me a lot about how to do laparoscopic surgery. And then after that, the US military took me for 4 years and sent me to war. And then after I was finished with that, I came right back as faculty again at OHSU. I've been there ever since. So Portland is a beautiful little city. It's about 2 million people, probably about the size of Agra. It's interesting, the subclavian transduction zone is off the coast of the western coast of America, and you have two teutonic plates that essentially fold under each other, creating a very volatile ring or sort of line of volcanic mountains. And one of them you can see here, which is in the background. This is Mount Hood, and this is the characteristic mountain that will define Portland for many, many people. North of here, this is out towards the east, north of here, in the state of Washington, where we're just on the coast, is a mountain by the name, well, there was an actual volcano there that actually blew its top back in 1980 or so. So it's somewhere where it's the only city in the US that is resided within an active volcano zone. So where California has its earthquakes, we have our volcanoes. This is OHSU. It's a quaternary care facility. It's built on a hill, and consequently, we've had to expand off the hill down to a waterfront down in this region here. And the main way of communicating between the two campuses is, of course, via tram. So we're one of the only universities, probably the only university in the United States that actually has a tram that connects the two campuses. So I only have about 37 slides, and it's not going to take too long to get through them all here, I hope. If there are any questions or anything as I go along, uncharacteristically, feel free to just ask me without having to save them up. But I shouldn't take 2 hours or so to go through these topics. We're talking about the past, the present, and the future. And in the future, I want to talk particularly about trends and predictions about where robotics is going, where we're going to go with robotics as far as education, as far as platforms are concerned. So the word robot, it's the Czechoslovakian language that actually gave us the term robots. And it's based on the Czech word for robota, which is forced labor or conscription. And Karel Kaptek, who was a very social activist and playwright and even a poet, was the first to bring forward the idea of the robot in a play of his called Rossum's Universal Robots in 1921. This was in, as you might remember, in 1921, the industrialization of Europe was in full swing. And as an outcry against the industrialization of Europe, he used this play as a means of protesting against it. Now, it didn't do very well with him, but when it went to England at St. Martin's Theatre in 1922, as you well know, the English like to complain about a lot of stuff, but to tell you the truth, in 1922, working class England, you have a play about the industrialization of Europe, and it's not going to sit very well. So it generated an incredible amount of talk in the common press to the extent that the word robot became entrenched in the vernaculum at that point in time. And that was 1922. This wasn't science fiction into the modern age. This was 1922. The idea of robotics is a little bit beyond that. The idea of what happens. A robot is an entity within itself. The actual area of study in robotics can be attributed to the Russian-American biochemist Isaac Asimov. And I think everybody knows Isaac Asimov because of his iRobot trilogy, The 3 Laws of Robotics. He was the first one to bring this out. And he did so in 1932 in a play called Runabout. And if that didn't capture your imagination, the idea of robotics, then it's certainly the play I, Robot, which was to follow in 1942, was something that really did. So, not surprising, this was back in the 1940s. The first commercial robot was produced for GM, General Motors Corporation in the United States. And it was called Unimate, or the Universal Automated Robot. Universal Automated Robot. And this was a time during the beginning of World War II when there were 2 things going on. The first being there was a shortage of skilled labor. And secondly, some of the things we were asked to do because of the war effort was particularly dangerous. You know, die casting and welding, particularly in shipbuildings, exposed workers to high heat levels, fire. There was a large injury level. So GM decided to commission building a robot that would allow them to do these very high-risk things. And that was the birth of the first robot, Universal Automated Robot for GM. At the end of the First World War, of course, we know the tragedy. We dropped an atomic bomb in Japan. At that point, the U.S. formed the Atomic Energy Commission, which was in vogue until 1975. The Atomic Energy Commission was founded to essentially repurpose and expand nuclear programs. But we didn't know a whole lot about it. Outside of the Manhattan Project, most mainline physicists did not know a lot about nuclear chemistry, nuclear physics, and they needed to do research. And a lot of these isotopes were largely unknown as well. So this is a very dangerous area to have individuals actually working in. So the Atomic Energy Agency said we need to build toys. We need to build toys because doing research in this area meant exposing researchers to deadly materials. And that is not what they really wanted to do. We already had mortality enough from a world war. Exposing your workers to something after this was not exactly what any government wanted to see. So there was a large stimulus on their part to get interested in developing tools that would let scientists work with radioactive materials. And this was the era of robotics. This is when it was really born. As you can see here, this is one of the first areas that we've seen as far as robotics is concerned. And this is the Argonne National Labs. If you look here, you can see the very prototypical glove system that's still in use today in certain areas. But this became the first extension of robotics, the arm. And you'll see the motifs that go through this talk. Robotics is simply an arm, use of a human arm, but it's a mechanical use of a human arm. What makes it different is what drives. Is it an organic brain that drives that arm? Is it a mechanical brain that drives that arm? And you'll see that that's our transition as we move forward, is from using our organic or neural networks to having a purely mechanical network driving that brain. And that's where we will be in the future. But for right now, back in the 1940s, this was the best you could get. And this was the best you could get if you wanted to collect the radioactive garbage in here as well, too. So obviously, there was a need for progress, a need for change. And an engineer at the Argonne National Labs by the name of Raymond Gertz was the first to develop the teleoperated articulated arm. And the patent of which is the patent diagram of which is shown right here. And this was the first master-slave manipulator. The key thing about this is it actually had haptics. The idea that if the transmission of resistance against your pole was actually the transmissions of resistance against your pole, which is an interesting thing because the modern robots we have now, the surgical robots we have now, do not have haptics. And the problem is, as you go from something as large as this MSM down to something small, you have to miniaturize the circuits. You have to sacrifice certain things. And modern robots have sacrificed haptics. They may well return, I think they will, but for right now, it's incumbent upon the surgeon to know exactly what the right or left hand is doing at any given time. In my profession, as I say, if I'm not acutely aware of what my left hand is doing as I'm pulling on the stomach, I may well end up with a piece of the front wall of the stomach in my left hand. And that's not what I really want to do. But haptics is a very important thing, and obviously became a very important thing in the research from atomic materials. As you can see here, these MSMs started popping up in different areas, whether as isolated cells. I don't really know why you'd leave the door open for this here, but as isolated cells, as large laboratory cellular structures, or even in nuclear power plants. This is one of the first nuclear power plants where the fuel rods were actually processed into the reactor. And in many ways, having people stand up and do this, I think, is probably the purveyor to what we consider to be the stand-up desk at this point in time as well. This is just an illustration of what the MSM looked at. As you can see, it was very, very facile. And I play this over and over again because it does two things. It either makes me very dizzy or it's very disturbing, and I don't know which. Now, surgical robots, there was a fair amount of time passed before surgical robots were used. The first surgical robot was used in 1985. It is a Puma 200. If you'll notice, the Puma 200 is the Puma 200, but if you remember, we talked about the Unimate. So this was still just the GM arm. We had advanced a little bit in our ability to program. And in the programming itself, we started to find the ability to very precisely move things around to do it. The extent that this arm did a brain biopsy, this isn't actually the brain biopsy, this is just a mock-up, but it actually did a brain biopsy with, 5/100ths of a millimeter precision. And something which, if you're a brain surgeon, is very, very important. Our orthopedic surgeons, any orthopedic surgeons here today, by any chance? Oh, there we go. I was about to say our orthopedic surgeons also came up with a RoboDoc as well in 1992 in order to be able to ream the femoral shaft in preparation for the prosthesis. But for the rest of us general surgeons, there was a classic age in the 1980s where telepresence, where this idea of robotics met laparoscopy. And as you may well imagine, in the 1980s with the area of the shuttle, there was great shuttle missions all over the place. Space exploration was a big thing. We were going to go to Mars. We're going to go back to the moon again. We're flying the shuttle on different missions. NASA said, well, what are we going to do if we need to perform a surgical procedure on somebody who's in space? Said, well, I think we need to start looking about this telepresence thing, this idea that we can really do this. And their scientists started looking into it. And Scott Fisher and Joe Rosen, who were two NASA scientists in 1980, developed two things: a 3D vision, which is one of the things that are very important for you to be able to do this type of surgery. And secondly, the data glove. And the data glove was a glove with a number of different receptors and sensors on it that actually transmitted mechanical movement of your hand into electrical energy, which was then processed in a processor and sent off to an arm. And there's an example of it here. It's not really to any great degree the real arm itself, but this is essentially what you're looking at. And you see this today in animation. It's not something that's completely new. You do see it in animation this day and age. In general surgery itself, Eric Muet, as we well know, performed the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy in 1985. And that's when laparoscopy was born. So we've got this meeting of the minds. We have telepresence and laparoscopy. What does laparoscopy do? Laparoscopy allows us to put things into people's body through very small incisions, and then we have to actually develop means of moving those instruments around to do something. Well, that's great. Well, how about if we use the motif of the arm and we simply have the arm do that for us now? And we step back, we take control of that arm. You can see where the ground is very fertile for the development of laparoscopy in this. DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, is a U.S. agency. It's characterized by two things: its ability and its willingness to devote huge amounts of funds to projects that are, on the most part, doomed to failure. Very high-risk projects that are doomed to failure. And secondly, usually projects that will have a defense sort of bent to them as well. So they're the natural folks who said, well, in the battlefield of the future, we've come off the Cold War, the Berlin Wall has fallen, this was 1989, we've come off the Cold War. What's the battlefield of the future going to be like? Do we need to send our surgeons out into the front line, or can we have them back? And can we have a telepresence robot out there allowing them to do surgery? So DARPA started funding a lot of these areas where laparoscopic surgery, they said, it's got potential. And one of those fundings was for Dr. Yulan Wang, who was an engineer. And he developed ESOP, which was the automated endoscopic system for optimal positioning. I actually used this in my fellowship. ESOP is a very sophisticated system, but all it really did was hold the camera. And ESOP had two ways of controlling it. You had a little device where you could move it up and down, and it would move up and down. But they added the extra area of you could actually use voice commands. You recorded your voice was recorded onto a chip, and the chip was inserted, almost like a SED or something, into the actual arm itself, and you could use voice commands to use ESOP. ESOP, move in, and it would move in. ESOP, move left, it would move left. So this, as you can see, became a very sophisticated way of applying a lot of this. To tell you the truth, it was completely cumbersome and redundant, but at the same time, it's one of those tools that if you're an advanced laparoscopic surgeon, you want to have in your inventory because it's something where you think it probably has application. Now, it didn't have a whole lot of application after that, believe it or not, but it did because Dr. Wang did form the company called Computer Motion. If you all remember Computer Motion, it was probably one of the first robotic corporations that really made surgical tools that really worked. A graduate student, a PhD student as well at Stanford at this time, Akhil Mandari, was very interested in engineering some of these. And he had been around, this is all Silicon Valley. This is all Silicon Valley where this is going on. And he had seen a number of talks given by a number of different surgeons out of Stanford who talked about the applications of robotics and laparoscopy. And he said, this is very fascinating for me. I'm going to develop a robotic arm. And this is what he developed. He developed the Black Falcon. The Black Falcon had haptics. This is the first robot that, again, had haptics. And here we are at a point in time where we have another arm. It's just simply another arm, a very sophisticated arm, But this, believe it or not, is the very arm that we use now in the Da Vinci system, because this was the prototype for the Da Vinci arm right here. And you can probably see a lot of, anybody who's seen the Da Vinci robot can see a lot of similarities to it at this point in time as well. So in the 90s, things moved very, very fast and very rapidly after that. An investment banker and two physicians, again from Stanford and the Palo Alto area, formed Intuitive Surgical in 1995. They're still around. They probably have the monopoly on most of the robotic surgery in the United States and indeed in the world in general. They obtained the patent on the Black Falcon. They obtained the patent on every possible other thing they could get, and they rolled it all into one company. At the same time, Computer Motions in 1999, again, had formed a company as well, and they had developed a different system. Their system was called Zeus. Now, the operating way of Zeus was a little bit different to Da Vinci. It's more or less you look down on something and use pedals to actually control it, which as you see here, this is the Zeus console, and these is the Socrates articulating arms. So these are the arms that are controlled. And they've done a very good job of actually engineering those as well, to the extent that the FDA approved the Socrates telemedicine device in 2001. But Computer Motions got into a very embroiled lawsuit with Intuitive Surgery over copyright infringement. And at that time, Intuitive Surgical decided to buy the company out as a means of solving this problem, which they did, and Computer Motions failed to exist after that. So a lot of the technology of Computer Motions was now rolled into Intuitive Surgical, which is rapidly becoming the #1 robotic surgery system in the world. So where are we now as far as the present of robotic surgeries? Well, there are very few competitors. We do have some coming online. I'll mention some of them coming up here in the future. But there's an increasing number of units being installed internationally. And it's astounding. If you go to Computer Motions, if you go to the Da Vinci, actually go to the Da Vinci Intuitive Surgical headquarters in Sunnyvale, California, there's a large map of the world up there, and there's little magnetic beads in each robot, in each city or each region, and it's astounding to see the amount of silver that's just covering the entire globe. There's increasing utilization, principally because of very shrewd marketing on the part of Intuitive Surgical. They've done a very good job in making you believe, as we had talked about before, making you believe that you're not really a hospital until you have a robot. Even though you may have some of the world leaders in surgery or medicine within the walls of those hospitals, they have made it incumbent upon the fact that patients would probably be better served going to a smaller private hospital where the surgeons use robots to do these. So marketing has become a good thing as well. The studies I mentioned down here related to robotics and outcomes in surgery are largely mixed. I don't mean to say they're inferior. They're mixed because of the problem we're getting with the economic bent that we have for a lot of these different surgical robots. Economics is a big thing. Applications are a big thing. Learning curves are a big thing. We're still very early on in our learning experience here. There's a significant amount of literature coming out on robotic surgery and outcomes from individuals who are robotic surgeons who are also happen to be on the teaching staff or in one way or another on the teaching faculty for Intuitive Surgical. There's a lot of conflict of interest stuff going on here as well too. And I usually have a conflict of interest slide myself that I usually put up here first. I put my demographics, but I don't have any ties to the company at all, so it doesn't matter to me about what I have to say about them. I have been a proctor for the company in the past, but I have no ties to it now. There are a number of different publications coming out of there as well regarding a lot of what we do with robotic surgery. You'll find there a fair amount of those publications of individuals who are in the teaching faculty for Intuitive Surgical. So studies are mixed. It's very early on, but there are applications for a robot, but I think in no way, shape, or mean should you consider the robot to be an application for all sorts of surgery. So this is the current Da Vinci employment in India itself. There are 60 units currently here. So, and that's growing. That is absolutely growing as well. As the Indian economy as the superstructure, as the educational infrastructure grows, so too will the utilization of this. Southeast Asia is a growing market for intuitive surgical, and they tend to use their marketing things very, very well too. So what kind of Da Vinci system technology are currently available? Well, you have the usual Da Vinci SI, which is the workhorse that we have now, and it's used for simple cases as well as complex cases as well. The company did come out with a single port means of using this as well, surgery through just a single port of the umbilicus. It hasn't gained a whole lot of traction, but it is still available as well. The reason is you usually use single port surgery for things like gallbladders, pediatric appies, hernias. It doesn't, and you're not really going to use a robot to do gallbladders after you've basically got your learning curve out of the way. The real improvement we had now in how these surgical robots are employed is the Da Vinci Xi. Now I have to concede this is a very, very advanced machine. I've used the Da Vinci SI for a while. The Da Vinci SI has a way of pushing you away from the patient. Once you employ that device in its ever-lumbering arms, it has a very conceivable way of pushing you away from the patient. Very difficult to get in there. The Xi is not in any way, shape, or form like that at all. It's much, much more there. I'm very much a fan of it. I think it's probably going to take robotics to the next level, if and when we discover what the proper applications of robotics are. So let's take a look at the future for the last part of our talk here. There's going to be increasing case volume, no doubt about that. If you have a robot, you will be asked to use it, or you will learn to use it, or somewhere along the line, somebody will grab that robot and start using it as well. It's a means towards making a name for yourself in certain instances. And for young faculty, be the first one in an institute using a robot, that's almost the same as being the first surgeon to start doing laparoscopic surgery back in the 1990s. As you can see, it's a great, tremendous way for them to make a name for themselves. So there'll be increasing case volume. Finding a niche for robotics and surgery is really something that's going to be a challenge for the next 10 years or so. This is really, robotics should be just a tool in your toolbox. It is perfect. Surgery is perfect for surgery in small spaces where you need to do intricate surgery without a whole lot of usual surgical shaking. And those areas of the bony pelvis, inside the mouth, even in the sinuses, maybe applications for it in some sort of neurosurgeries. But by and large, for us GI surgeons, if you try and use a robot in the wide open space of the abdomen, then you have to undock. For instance, if you're doing bariatric surgery, you may well have to undock to do something laparoscopically and then dock back up again to do it robotically. So it takes a little time to do that. I think robotics in the future will be a different entity. And we should look forward to increased competition as well, because that's where things are going. I talked about increases in volume, and this is what it's showing us. 2016, we had well over 700,000 cases done worldwide. I think by this point in time, we're probably about 1 million robotic cases worldwide as well, too. And as you can see, our urologists have always led the way. And urology is probably one of the prototypical applications for robotic surgery. But what you see in here as well, from my own sort of area too, is this. The growing proportion of which is general surgery. And this is where Da Vinci surgery has started to market itself considerably now too, is into the realm of general surgery. Now, where or what are people doing within general surgery itself? Well, it'll be very interesting to tell you that most of those are now based on hernia repairs. And these are generally all private practice systems, small hospitals, or private practice surgeons doing this sort of operations as well. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I think after you get to a certain degree, if you can do 10 hernia surgeries in a day using the robot, well, excellent. I think your outcomes are probably going to be about the same, but you have to ask yourself, is it really economically feasible to do it or not? Some other areas we're finding it that is really growing is, of course, this colorectal. And I think the robot for pelvic floor operations, I think it's the perfect application for it as well. Down in the bony pelvis is the perfect place for this. It's made it a little easier as well because now Da Vinci surgery has come up with an articulating stapler, you can actually use down in the bony pelvis as well. And there's energy devices that allow you to be able to do a mesorectal incision much easier than would have done so before. So I think we've done a good job with introducing this into colorectal surgery. Bariatrics, not so much. As I said before, bariatrics is a multi-stage operation. And the clunkiness of the SI at this point in time makes it not feasible to really use that. And other, which is usually thoracic surgery. This just tells us an idea about how much this has evolved over the course of about 6 years or so. You can see that at best 2% of operations, and those were thoracic operations, were done with robotics back in 2009. Come forward to 2015, you see a large increase, a significant increase in the market share that's now being done by robotics. This is real. This is a growing trend. You can try and wish robotics away, but it's not. It's going to be there. It's going to stay. This is also a prediction on trends you're going to find for most surgical cases. And again, the prototypical one is in hernia repair. And then you're going to find areas for lobectomy for thoracic surgery too. So these are predictions that tell us it's not going to go away, volume is increasing, you better really adapt to that. So beyond the simple volumes of stuff, what does the future tell us about this here? Well, education, I think, is going to have a profound effect on education, postgraduate education, surgical education. There's going to be new platforms, new applications are going to be around as well. And we're going to have expanded architecture. And here I look at it in 3 ways. Remember I talked about the organic brain controlling the arm? So the telepresence is what I call the organomechanical arm. You control what is going on there as well. But there is a monitored function area that I talk about as well. And this is where a human brain will program a device or a computer to perform a surgical procedure. That's a little bit different. And then we get purely close to entirely automated surgical devices as well when we do mechano-mechanical. And those are either neural networks, synthetic networks. All of our engineering students down here in the front are probably going to be working on that in the future, but you can look forward to seeing that. And it's here. Some of this is here now. This is an interesting thing because they talked about how new procedures sometimes can cause an outcry, a radical outcry among the mainstream individuals who do it. And there's no better illustration of this than the case with Eric Muey, who did the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy in 1985. He was essentially ostracized from the German surgical establishment. He was threatened with a lawsuit, and nobody would take him seriously. That was 1985. Nowadays, the only way to take a gallbladder out is do it laparoscopically. So it's a strange way of doing things here. Prostates as well. Johann Bender, back in 2000, was the first one to do a laparoscopic prostatectomy. Nowadays, our urologists, by and large, do not have laparoscopic skills anymore because the robotic skills are top-notch. That's the way they take out prostates in this day and age there as well. As you can see, the same sentiment exists here for robotic surgery as well. Even the American College of Surgeons had to admit this as far back as 2013, saying there is a role for this too. So education is a very important thing, and you can see this in the amount of postgraduate training you're going to require here. Even back to the fact that most colorectal fellowships within the US will have Da Vinci training. Oncology fellowships will have Da Vinci training. GYN residents will say all of their faculty are using the robot, and urology residents, even our PGY2 urology residents, are on the robot in their second year of training. I can't graduate our fellows in our advanced GI surgery fellowship. I can't graduate them unless I certify them in robots. Because when they come out, that hospital or that program is going to be asking, oh, do you do robots? Do you have a robot thing? And they're saying that if they say they're not, they're automatically at a disadvantage. So it's an incredible sort of way that education is now being impacted by this. And I think this is something as educators here will have to realize is something in the future as well. We've had a consensus document. SAGE is one of my keynote or one of our main surgical societies back in the US. has a consensus document on robotic surgery. The thing is, it's been around since 2007. This is not new at all. There is now, SAGES is also offering in November 13, 14, 2017, a SAGES robotic course for fellows. Now, how did I find out about that? I got an email last week that told me about this. This is the future. Our fellows now are being brought in to get trained on robots and stuff. This is the future of surgical education. Unless your postgraduates or your residents are starting to learn about robotic education, they're going to be left behind. You have a journal. You've got a journal since 2004. So these are things that ordinarily you would not know about unless you knew a little bit more about robotics, but it is starting to come into the mainstream. So how about new platforms and the applications? Well, there are a number out there as well. The prototypic one I think most people know about is the Titan Medical, which again is an arm controlled by and large by telepresence. The organic coupling of mechanical arm. The MedRobotics system here, FDA approved, is a very interesting system. It's usually used for oral surgery, head and neck surgery, and surgery within the upper part of the GI or airway. And it's an interesting system because it's endoscopically applied and then small little devices come out and work. It's almost science fiction-like to see it at work here as well. But this is science fiction coming real. The non-FDA approved device that's currently being put is the SurgiBot, which, as you can see, brings us back again to our laparoscopic means of deploying things as a way of doing this. So there are systems out there. It's just a matter of time before they take over. Da Vinci has done a very good job of essentially tying up most of all the patents for how these arms work. So it's been a challenge for other companies to overcome this by trying to develop technologies that will go beyond pulleys and belts, which is really the only way you can get by a Da Vinci system is to get by there. Now, I talked about the architectures we had of there. So this is an example of Telepresence. This is Operation Lindbergh, which was performed in September of 2001. A group of French Canadians, when I talked about this a long time ago, I was corrected. They weren't American, they were French Canadian surgeons. Operating in New York City, actually removed the gallbladder from a patient in Strasbourg in France. This is a proof of concept issue, but it actually worked very, very well, very safely, and did so as well too. Now, the thing is, France's Telecom had to set up a dedicated means of providing almost real-time feedback. It was 1/16 of a second was the delay. So back in 2001, it came at an enormous cost to be able to do this. But the proof of concept was there. If you can remove a gallbladder from somebody in France when you're in New York, you can remove an appendix from somebody who potentially could be in Antarctica and not be able to get in there, or potentially somebody on the space station as well, if he can overcome the tyranny of distance. But it is there. I talked about monitored function. This is where an organic brain programs a robot and then assists. And this is an interesting thing. This is the smart tissue automated robot, which combines a 3D camera with infrared markings to differentiate tissue, and with some programming on the part of a human programmer, we find that it's able to do anastomosis. This is pig intestines, so it's actually doing anastomosis of pig intestines, and the human is doing nothing more than what human assistants do, which is assisted in laying down the sutures. So this is here. Then, of course, in the future, I talked about independent function. I had a video up here, and it's unfortunately, I don't think it's going to play, but if you remember Star Wars, and you remember the perennial problems that Luke Skywalker gets into and losing arms and having to get fixed up, you're always going to have the ever-present 2-1B medical droid there. And that's the droid that essentially does all of the work on him as well. And that's the droid that fixes up his hand. And the little clip I was going to show here was actually that. So I don't think it's going to play, but the link is here. And I mention this not because it's science fiction. I mention this because this is what's going to happen in the future. We will have mechanical based systems, artificial intelligence-based systems, algorithm-driven systems that will, by and large, start to provide some medicine. provide some surgical treatment for us in the future. So as Asimov said, it'll come to the point where you just can't differentiate between a robot and the very best of humans. At least that's what I hope is going to be the point. All right? And I'll end with that now. Thank you very, very much indeed. Glad to entertain any questions.
Excellent presentation, sir. I'm Dr. Darwin, ENT surgeon, and we know that how important it is for our territory also, where we excise oropharyngeal and laryngeal and tracheal tumors with robotics. And in fact, I'll say that robotics and lasers, if we don't have these two things, it makes us handicapped in laryngeal surgery. My question for you is how we can reduce this learning curve, and we know that this has got a long learning curve, and due to reduce resources as well as patient profile, how we can reduce this learning curve?
Particularly in head and neck surgery in particular, or in general?
In general, as such.
In general, yes. So the robot, I see the robot. The thing with the robot will take a mediocre surgeon and make them good. The robot will take a good surgeon and make them excellent. It will take a very seasoned surgeon and make them even better than that. Now, there are instances here where the learning curve cannot be too steep depending on how well you are at doing that procedure to begin with. So for instance, if you do a lot of transoral work, and you do it through the open thing, and you put that large device in and you hang somebody's, as ULD, you hang everybody's jaw up here, and you work in there, then it doesn't take a huge learning curve if you were to put I think it's TORS, if you put a TORS module in here and do the very same thing using a robot. Now, what is different here is the fact that you're not there with the patient. You're somewhere else. And that's the big difference. Now, technically, it's very easy to do it. What you have to overcome is the idea of not being there with your patient. That requires a simulation lab. That requires a simulation lab with a robot. And it's not good enough where you take a robot and you get proctored for 2 cases and they say, okay, go, do what you want. You have to have a robot. You have to have a simulation lab that has a robotics, that has a simulation module on the back of it, so you can learn the nuances of doing this. Secondly, you need to start with easy cases, not the most difficult ones, the most easiest cases indeed. And that's why I don't criticize in our realm, I don't criticize people taking out gallbladders or doing hernias on the robot as long as it's teaching them the skills to do it. But if you put both of those things together, it will decrease your curve, insofar as you're already a very good surgeon to begin with in that area.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. James, thank you for enlightening us about the robotics and robotic surgery. I have a lot of questions for you. We are eagerly awaiting.
I can only answer 2, though.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
All right.
Please.
I think in a developing country like us, where cost matters a lot, so would you like to throw some light about cost versus benefit? Second, I think this is a very huge machine, and it certainly would require a lot of upgradations so that it doesn't become a junk in the future.
Yes.
That's a kind of a big question mark for that. And other thing is in future, at the moment, are we becoming slave to the machine? Our machine will become slave to us? Putting artificial intelligence will someday, a robot will be able to scan the complete thing, read everything, and do everything? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah. So the cost issue here is staggering. I think when you do that, the first thing we'll talk about is the economics of it. There's no sense to the economics of a robot. Considering you pay $1 million, in the US it's $1 million for a thing there. The most expensive part of it is the service agreement that comes along with that as well. That's it. Now, what you usually buy is you buy that robot and you amortize it over the course of perhaps 10 years for that robot. And you try and bring it back in getting people out of the hospital faster and minimizing complications that will either bring people back in or keep people in the hospital. So that becomes the fire in which we all burn, is hospital stay and hospital costs. I see if you can do a biliary anastomosis with a robot to the extent that you're not going to have a leak, or a pancreatic anastomosis to the extent you're not going to have a leak, or a colon anastomosis to the extent you're not going to have a leak, I think the robot is worth it in those terms, as long as you do a very good number of cases to realize your gain. I think that's where the economics of the robot come in. I think that's where it comes in. There have been some studies out there as well that looked at colorectal cases with the robots, and they're finding that, and this is, again, I think this is related to the visualization you see as well, but you're actually able to see things better. You do a better mesorectal excision, you do a better control, a better nerve-sparing operation, and you actually end up with less abscesses, less leakage, quicker. I don't know how it is, but they leave hospital quicker. And if you do that in a very busy practice, you can see over time you're probably going to make economic sense. By and large, unless that's the situation you're in, you're not going to make economic sense very much at all. Second thing is, it's very difficult to protect yourself, from your second question, against having to upgrade every few years. We've been lucky enough so far where we've had the XI is the newest the newest model we had, but before that the SI was one that's been around for a number of years, and it's done a very good job. I think people have managed to realize economic benefit of that. If we are starting to have to upgrade every few years and do a new system, I think it's going to be much difficult at that point in time. And it's going to require our accountants and our individuals to actually have a little bit, going to have them have more negotiating power on their part as well. I think with competition, we're going to bring prices down a little bit. Third thing you alluded to is the idea of artificial intelligence. I think it's going to be a long time before a purely neural network that is equivalent to what we have in our cranium is going to be able to do the architectural and decision-making that a robot would do. Most of what I see in artificial intelligence for the next 20 years or so will be the rudimentary triaging and something that can almost be an assistant to the regular surgeon. Now, there's nothing to say you can't be a meta controller of a lot of stuff as well. In other words, one organic brain controlling a number of different systems. But I don't think within the foreseeable future, within our future at least, I don't see the robots as taking over and getting us, doing us out of a job or anything else there. So Dr. Dash, like he said, he'll be just fine. He's not gonna lose any of his system.
Hi, your talk was a very fascinating one, and especially because it comes at a time when India and the total knee replacement market has 4 robots in the country. But the basic point of it all is that, like what happened in navigation, there was a lot of navigation to start with, and over a period of time, the community and the academia realized that it was doing almost as good or as bad as a standard conventional total knee would. And then they raised the bar to 15 years and improved results and longer term data, till such time they actually came to a point to identify when and where the navigation was actually a beautiful tool. And probably the same thing is going to happen with the robotics. And as you mentioned initially, and if and when we realize where the robot actually is a very, very big help. But the point of it all is how much money as economies, as institutions, as practitioners, are we willing to spend on it? Because it's got a learning curve, and it's very expensive. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the patient who's going to pay for it. So how much are we willing to pay for it to actually reach a point in time, maybe 10 or 15 years before we realize, okay, this is where we're going to be able to use it. And it's not going to replace standard practice, it's just going to be an add-on. So how much money for what technology?
Yeah, it's, I think the key at this point in time for economics is the idea of competition, which we don't have. I've shown you some of our new units out here as well. they will have market traction here in the coming years because simply because the Da Vinci system has it's priced itself too high. And any system itself prices itself too high, when a new system will come in at a lower price, will automatically garnish a lot of attention. I think that's the key to economics, at least in the foreseeable future, is that sort of an area as well. As a health system, let's just say, as a entity, as a public health entity, looking at the health of your general population, I think at this point in time, it's probably better to make sure that in developing countries, most people will be vaccinated, have the usual basic health care before considering investing in a lot of these robots as well, too. As you say as well, they're an adjunct. They make very good surgeons better. But as a general rule, if you're a very good surgeon, you tend to do very good work, regardless what platform you're going to use. And I think that's the thing that we have to think about, too. You know, it's a purely economic argument. And I think by and large, the idea, the thing that has seduced so much of us here is the marketing from the company. And the company itself has decided to tell us, as I said before, you're not really an institution unless you have a robot. They've done this very, very well. But as we're seeing, this argument's becoming a little more jaded as we see the results are equivalent. Maybe some of them are better, depending on what you want to do. But we're starting to really crystallize the fact that if you have a robot and you're going to use it, you generally use it for a very specific, very sophisticated reason. By and large, it's not economically feasible to have a robot at all. I agree with you there. But again, I think competition in the future is something that will drive the price down to the extent that most economies will have the ability to provide robotic services to a large majority of their patients, but not at this time.
That was an excellent presentation. So I wanted to inquire from the patient point of view. Those patients who are approaching you, what is their opinion when you say that I am going to operate a robot using a robot, or the other conventional surgeons who operate by hand?
For most, as a surgeon, when somebody comes to see me to do a thing, I can sell anything to them. As a surgeon, you can generally tell people if they need an operation, you can tell them they need an operation and usually be able to agree with it. People who come to me who ask for robotic surgery in general are people who believe that the robots provide some element of science fiction-based sophistication that's not there in me as an organic person. And to them, that's kind of the allure as well. And it's interesting because everybody wants to seek the best means for an operation for them as they perceive it that will allow them not only to have the most sophisticated and advanced procedures done, but by the best doctors as well. So you may be the best doctor, but if you've got a robot, all of a sudden you become an excellent doctor to that. And that's where the marketing has, again, the marketing has done it very, and it's direct to patient marketing that has done that. There's no in between. The patients see this and they'll believe anything they're basically heard about as well too. I have to be very selective where I use the robot. People may come to me and ask me to do a robotic bowel resection or something, and I would say, well, can I tell you something? It's not really feasible to do that. But if you need to have a Heller myotomy because of achalasia, I think the robot is a perfect thing for that because of the visualization, the small area, and you're able to do it as well. So I think as a practitioner, as a surgeon, you have an obligation to use this as a tool, to reach into your toolbox and say, this is the tool I'll use for you because this is the best one. I don't believe, and unfortunately there are probably practitioners out there who believe they'll use the robot for everything. And I think people are sometimes fooled into believing if you're using a robot, you're getting 22nd century surgery, by HAL 9000 or something like that. And I think that's where the disconnect comes in.
Hello, I'm Dr. Amit Goyal, an ENT surgeon. Quite an stimulating talk. I just want to ask that there is a lot of finances involved with the robots. And US is largely an insurance-driven market as far as medical services are concerned. So how you could convince insurance companies, because there would have been a lot of difference in the cost to the patient. So are the companies readily coming to fund for that, or it's mainly still self-funding patients they are being operated?
Yeah, a very good question. The insurance company, the private insurance company in the United States, do not have provisions for robotic surgery. In other words, so if you're going to have a laparoscopic esophagectomy, for instance, laparoscopic esophagectomy, whether you do that with a robotic assistant or do it laparoscopically, you still get the same reimbursement. There's no extra reimbursement for the robot. The robot for them is nothing. The robot for them is something that the hospital acquires the cost of it and amortizes it over 10 years or so too. So there's no specific CPT code for robotics and stuff. It's usually, for the patient, there's no added cost to it either. So it's the hospital that assumes all the costs for the robots. And that becomes the draining point for a lot of hospitals too. If you're a small hospital and you buy a $1 million robot, then you better find a means of using that $1 million robot. Either attracting extra patients because they believe you have a robot, or training all your physicians to use it in that way as well. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I request Director of our institute, Dr. Sanjeev Mishra, to please give a token of appreciation to James Dolan.